It's Wednesday, September 9th, 2020, the second session of American Public Policy Redo. As always, we're going to begin with just a little housekeeping. Just a reminder, this is being recorded. So if you do unmute yourself and you do have a question, which is wonderful and always encouraged, you will be recorded. We're definitely going to encourage asking the questions directly, but if you cannot or you choose not to, just feel free to type them into the chat feature of the session. The recording is the speaker view with a shared screen view or vice versa, depending on how it's set up at the moment. So even though you may be seeing everyone in gallery view, the recording itself, if you haven't seen it on YouTube, is just the speaker at the moment. So Pat in the screen of whatever he's sharing at the moment. But we purposely set it up so everyone can unmute themselves at any time. So Pat and I talked after, based on the dialogue that was in the chat after, and at the end of the session, we're going to just go for it and see what happens. And rather than moderating questions, if you have a question, just jump on in, interrupt Pat. No need to raise your hand. Let's just see how that works for now, even the next session. And then if we need to rein it back a bit for whatever reason, even technology might be a reason, then we'll certainly let you know at the beginning of the session that we do that. A couple of things on the questionnaire. Thank you so much for filling those out. They're really helpful to Pat, and even for myself to get the feedback on a Zoom end of if there's anything more that we could be doing. The two people had actually asked about a Facebook group chat or Facebook group to talk in between these sessions, to share resources. Pat said that that's a great idea. He said he would want to be able to post even more recent things to read if you are so inclined. So in the next follow-up email, I'll include a link to that Facebook group if you are inclined to join that and participate at your leisure, as they say. And then also we had a recommendation, suggestion for small breakout groups. So tonight, it doesn't have so much of what Pat had told me beforehand, is that tonight doesn't have so much of a strong structure, so we won't be doing that this time, but maybe next time, if the conversation leads itself to, we might try a small breakout group type setting in Zoom, which is very easy to do for 5 to 10 minutes, just so we could get more dialogue between us as well, which was really fun in the chat section last time. And then lastly, Pat now has a conflict on Wednesday nights. So the sessions are going to be moved to Thursday nights at the same time, but they are always available on YouTube, and within 2-3 days of however we can quickly get them together and get them posted as well, and you'll get the email with the link for the last session. So if you're unable to make it, I know Wednesday worked for a lot of folks, but life happens, so we're moving it to Thursday. So, but at the same time, 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern. So that is all I have. I'm going to put myself on mute. And
quickly, Michelle, so we're moving it to Thursday starting next week then, just to be clear?
Yes.
So next week. Okay.
Yes, thank you so much for the clarification. Yep, next week it will be on Thursday, and I'll send probably 2 reminders, just so folks also aren't even texting me right now. They're trying to get in, so they are not texting me on Wednesday night going, "Where are you, Michelle, and where's the class?" So, all right, Pat, the floor is yours.
Okay. I told Michelle before we got started that this may feel a little bit disjointed for a lot of this evening, just because I got and appreciated a bunch of comments and ideas, and I'm going to kind of, there are some of them that I can take care of relatively quickly, and then we can move on to the more interesting stuff. One, I did start going through to get more recent sources on agenda setting, but here's the problem. Political scientists left the field. I think in large part because it was something that was really hard to study in a systematic, quantitative kind of way. As a result, most of the new stuff, and I'll go ahead and post it, but it doesn't have the same political policy focus that the literature from a long time ago had, okay? It's mostly communication studies folks doing this stuff, focused on the media, in large part because that's something that they could quantify. Okay, it enabled them to put these studies together. But nonetheless, I figure you might as well see that stuff. So that's one thing, and I can post that for the Facebook group. I just wanted to give you a heads up. It's not going to have the same kind of policy focus that I gave agenda setting in class. Okay. Second thing is, it was only like a couple of folks, but it was, I got a couple of comments like, well, I didn't really get anything out of that last class because I already knew all that stuff, which is fair. But I think that I kind of gave an explanation for why I was doing that. That we had folks who hadn't had the class, even some folks who were like not political science majors. But let me beat this dead horse. In addition to some folks not having the class and they got to come up to speed, I don't think that you fully understand the current situation unless you understand the old system and then think about how we're moving into it. It's not as though you could just like jump into this new system and figure it out. For one thing, nobody's done that yet. And I think that you understand it more fully if you see how it has evolved from that old system. And then another point is that a lot of folks are, and they're, that this is why, you know, I love you guys. You want to focus on the normative questions about making policy more effectively, more democratically, okay? I think that we will do that more intelligently if we get a handle on both systems. For those folks who took the old class, I kind of hope you remember that I was pretty critical of the old system. It looks like heaven now, but there were reasons that the old system was flawed. It's not as though we moved from a world of perfection to this hellish system that we're in. We transitioned from one flawed policymaking system to another differently flawed. I mean, I think all of us could probably agree it's a more seriously flawed, but differently flawed system. So if we want to look at it in normative terms and think about how we move forward, I think you want to recognize that we didn't move. It's not as though we just moved back to the old system. That's not enough. And so we need to sort of get a handle on that as well. So hopefully everybody is on board with that. One really quick thing, just because y'all deserve a little bit of entertainment as well. Remember that study that I trotted out there, the one from Stephen Cull was the main investigator. It had to do with media reliance and levels of misinformation. There was actually a back and forth between different commentators. That got a lot of publicity. So forgive me for enjoying the humor of this. Folks who wanted to defend Fox News, this may speak to their level of intelligence, but they wanted to defend Fox News because, after all, they said, Fox News viewers aren't that well educated. It's not much of a defense, but so the investigators went back and said, no, we've actually controlled for those factors that predict levels of political knowledge which presumably the converse would predict misinformation, regardless of someone's level of education. If they relied on Fox, they had significantly higher levels of misinformation. And I just think that's at least mildly entertaining. I really liked a comment. It came up in the comments and also came up in the session last time about the existence of these echo chambers on social media. I just wanted to add one element. The political science research on this topic has emphasized another point, and that is because you get niche media on cable TV, you can have niche exposure on social media. That means that it's easier now for lots of ordinary citizens to completely avoid politics, completely avoid them. In the old media system, you couldn't avoid it because CBS, ABC, NBC, they were all going to have the same, pretty much the same news, and they weren't, you had no place to go if you wanted to ignore politics. And that's, I want you to kind of put a pin in that puppy, because we're going to use that when we come back at the very end. You know, there were a couple of things that I think I'll probably respond privately to the folks, just to give the general discussion a little more time here. But there was one more thing, and it was, and this is to kind of open this up. I thought it'd be good to open things up pretty early. Someone made a really important, huge, valuable point about the impact of these separate information systems on social life. And I thought this is a great time for you folks to jump in and talk about what you have observed in your social sphere about the impact of that on that social life. And so this is the time to like jump on in, like tell your stories about what you've seen.
And just remember, you need to unmute yourself when you do.
Yeah.
Because you could be talking away and we can't hear you.
Okay, so this is Anne. I'll jump in just for fun. So I'm in Atlanta, and we have actually a St. Mary's Club book club, and it's pretty multi-generational. And you know, we've been meeting on Zoom, given COVID, and you know, discussions about COVID. And of course, I work at CDC, so everybody's always like pummeling me with questions. And I recently learned that one of the women on the group, who, you know, we're all friends, everything, acquaintances, and essentially she said that, and she wears masks and things, but you know, she happens to support President Trump, but that's not the point. Not the point here. The point is she, you know, wears a mask because she thinks that's correct based on public health recommendations. But when she goes to social gatherings, she feels concerned because she thinks people are going to view her as a Democrat and not a Republican. You know, and it's sort of appalling to her. You know, I mean, she's sort of following the public health recommendations, but it's this barrier. And I sort of knew there was this political divide with respect to masks and public health recommendations, but to hear it so, you know, directly, to your point, Pat, was, you know, it's just like, it was just such a barrier. And you know, she was even a little hesitant to bring it up to me, and I'm like, well, you know, I mean, you can believe what you want to believe, vote for whoever you want, you know. I'm not police, but you know, Interesting. So your point, it has created barriers, and I've seen it in other ways in my community with, colleagues, people that I, acquaintances, people I play tennis with. I see it as a problem. 20 years ago, I never saw it as a problem. I had lots of friends we all had different political views, but I see it as a problem now. It was never a problem previously, but now it's a problem. So there you go.
Yeah. And I don't know if that's so much the separate media systems. That's actually what that makes me think of for those poor souls who took 151 from me and we did the thing on freedom. It sounds like John Stuart Mill talking about the oppressive power of public opinion, is that when you're in that kind of environment where there's a clear majority sentiment, and it can change depending on where you happen to be. If you think that what you believe runs counter to that social environment, you will keep your mouth shut. You won't say a thing. You will conform because you don't want to be ostracized in that setting. That also was a project in mass media and public opinion. And so that part, I think that's intensified by the partisan polarization. I don't know how much the separate media systems are feeding into it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, she specifically said she watches Trump, but watches Fox News.
Right.
But right, I don't think it's just that, but it's sort of a symptom of where we are in our ability to dialogue.
Yeah.
With people, which is what concerns me.
Yeah.
The challenges with dialoguing with people who may have different views.
Right.
Leslie, you said you were going to jump in. I'm paying attention to who unmutes first, if anybody matters. Go ahead.
And I'm in Atlanta too. So hey, we've had some real interesting familial issues on partisan discussions that I think have changed over time. Whereas, for example, my father, who I didn't actually have a very close relationship growing up with him, but is an avid 24-hour consumer of Fox News. And he only really became interested in politics late in his life. And so he uses social media and these very obscure media sources and keeps posting things that, at least in the line of work that I do, which I'm in charge of a nonpartisan state agency similar to GAO. So this really goes against every grain I have, which should be fact and evidence-based policy decisions. So he puts that out there, and he happened to recently try to engage my 19-year-old son on the issue of riots and looters and that sort of thing. And my son, who, God love him, says, I'm going to be an anti-racist, starts fact-checking his information and says, Grandpa, I can't confirm about 90% of your facts. And, you know, the things that you're saying, you have to understand really sound racist and that kind of thing, which led to this ongoing text argument between my son and my dad, which I kept saying social media and text is not the way to have a nuanced conversation about this. You should stop the conversation. And my father was unwilling to be the adult in the room and stop that. So it really devolved, and then I became like the intermediary at the end, whereas I'm ending all discussion with your son about this because he should respect my seniority. And that was really his only basis, because he didn't know how to deal with him on the facts, but he was really regurgitating most of what he was consuming from Fox News. And so I guess that's just one example where in our family, we feel like we only discuss these things now among like-minded individuals. Whereas previously that was not the case. And I even decide, I felt like I was complicit, but I could not possibly do the work of challenging every post that my father put out, because it would be a full-time job about what is wrong with this information. So I didn't engage, but my son did. And it has really created, an unprecedented situation where we can't even agree on the facts. Like, there aren't facts to be discussed, and that your differences are about how to handle a situation. Is we can't even get to agreement on the facts. And so that's just an anecdote, but it's something that I've really seen within our family, which is that it really is difficult, once you know someone's political leanings, to have a cross-partisan discussion without it devolving into more of an emotional discussion.
Yeah, because everybody's feet are sort of set in concrete at that point, and then you can't bridge that. And I think that was kind of where the comment was going, that building community and social capital becomes next to impossible in this kind of informational system. And part of this is the informational system, and part of it is the social media part, where folks can interact a great deal anonymously, and certainly not face-to-face. And it's easier to say horrible, horrible things to someone if you're never going to meet them, if you're never going to interact with them face-to-face. So it just strikes me, I mean, I think that's a really telling anecdote, because you have sort of the two factors, right? I mean, you have these echo chamber informational systems, but on top of that, you have the anonymity of social media, and the distanced communication from face-to-face communication, and that those two things together can really beat up on social capital and community. And I'm sorry, because it looked like Megan was ready to jump in.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, Pat, that I think this goes even beyond social media, because nowadays, well, like podcasts, YouTube, obviously these can be shared on social media, and that's like a way of communicating. But I had a similar experience with a family member where he was sharing all this crazy information, and I consider myself a follower of current events, and I'm like, where are you even getting this crazy stuff? Like, I'm like, and I was genuinely like, I really want to know, like, where are you getting this? Like, I genuinely want to know. And he gave me these lists of like 5 or 6 podcasts, and I was like, oh my God. And I looked them up. I'd never heard of them. And they were just these crazy, crazy things. And I was like, it's just anyone can create a podcast, right? Yeah. And so all of a sudden, it just opened my eyes so much more, even beyond social media, to recognize there are probably a lot of people out there who are following these types of various podcasts that I personally have no awareness of. And that's really kind of scary. Like, it's concerning to think about that, and like how many people are using that as like their news. So yeah, I mean, social media like spreads it for sure, but the podcast and YouTube world is like a whole nother level, I think.
I bet. I think what we're doing is kind of putting these things together, because they're getting to those podcasts through the echo chambers and the social media, and that's how they learn about it. Like ordinary mere mortals wouldn't know about a bunch of those podcasts. You learn about the podcasts because you're in the echo chamber, you're in the social media, the algorithms of the social media then put you in touch with those podcasts and all those other sources. Does that make sense, Megan?
Yeah, that does.
Okay. Anybody else?
Hi, so, oh, there we go. I'm Kate, and I'm in Dallas, and so I'm conservative and also run in some conservative circles. I would say that even within my conservative circles, there's a diversity of opinion. And so it does depend even there about where you're getting your information from. There's a lot of local journalists who are getting some good information and others that are spinning it. But one thing that I really took away from last week, not a partisan issue, but one of my mentors is a judge locally and got pulled into this dramatic like Facebook drama because a parent claimed that a child was being trafficked by another parent. And so, I mean, and this judge is truly one of the biggest advocates for children that I've ever encountered. But because of that imagery and because of the soundbite that made its way through Facebook, there were hackers that ended up putting her personal information on the internet, and she ended up receiving death threats. And I mean, it really, really became a huge issue. And so I see this happening not only on a partisan level, but on soundbite information, and like real people and good people are definitely impacted by it. And, you know, she's a white female conservative judge in probably one of the most conservative counties in Texas. And it was conservatives who were getting misinformed, who were really going after her.
Yeah. I mean that, Katie, wow, that's like, that's like really kicking up the level of destruction of social capital and community. When you can have, you can essentially throw bombs.
I mean, she's in our county, there are more female judges, district court judges, than there are in anywhere else that I'm aware of that I've practiced. And she's been on the bench longer than anyone else. So, I mean, she has made it her career to be an advocate. I mean, to the extent, you know, she's involved in other organizations, but to look out for children's interests. So, I mean, it's just insane how careers and reputations can be attacked via social media.
Yeah. Can I ask you about the range of, I'm not sure what I'm talking about, but the range that you're seeing among conservatives, because you're seeing differences, right? So what does that range look like that you see?
Well, so right now I sit on the board for the Republican, it's called the Golden Corridor Republican Women's Club, and it's the largest club in North Dallas, Collin County. Within that club, I'd say the majority of people are Trump supporters. The majority of people watch Fox News. Yeah. But I think everyone kind of recognizes that you have different people with different levels of risk. And so we have moved our meetings to be part Zoom, part in person. So for the people who want to be in person, they can. Within my close network of friends there, I mean, I have a good friend whose child has cancer. And so we take every opportunity to social distance because it's not worth the risk for her, but in just kind of recognizing that. My colleague who is officing over here, but he is one of the founders of Open Texas. And has been very involved in making sure that businesses can stay open.
Yeah.
And so my firm's very involved in a lot of those things. So there's a broad range. I mean, and in our firm alone, it was a huge issue about wearing masks, because you have some people who are, you know, Open Texas, no masks, and other people who are concerned. And so we're wearing masks just out of courtesy for other people.
Yeah.
But
I think personally, I saw it with the Bernie Sanders crowd. You know, on the left, that's where the sort of wild stuff would come from. And I ventured into a discussion on Facebook. I'll out myself. All right, I supported Elizabeth Warren in the nomination process, but that's not, for the Bernie folks, that's not good enough. And in fact, you're not liberal enough. You know, it had that detachment from reality that I think makes, you know, the wild detachment from reality that you experienced with the postings about your friend the judge. And I just got savaged on this page. And it was originally a post by a woman who used to run IT here. And she and I knew each other, and we're not that close politically, but we were friends. So again, I'm going to go back to the thing about social capital. So we could be considerate of one another. We could have those differences because we'd established some kind of personal connection. But none of her friends were buying this. She sort of vouched, no, this guy has integrity, da 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 da. Well, they weren't buying any of it. So it became impervious to even that kind of attempt to say, no, there are reasons to be connected here. No. It just, the ease with which everything gets blown up. And I think your comment has the real value of saying it's not a black and white Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative. It's like across the spectrum, which just exacerbates those problems, right? For community, for building some kind of social capital, folks' willingness to trust one another just becomes really difficult. So yeah, that's really valuable, Kate.
I think I recently maybe come to the conclusion that there's so many various outlets for news, or at least information. Maybe I wouldn't say news, but what people might take as news or opinions, they might then take as their own, or then convert them to fact. That you can kind of pick your own reality. I think sadly, after last week, my takeaway was I think it all kind of comes down to build, or at least originally with the Fox News model that other networks then picked up. It's getting ad revenue, and you've seen this also, on these social media outlets as well. And I think, that to me is more than political party, whether you're leaning left or right, it's that you can pick the world that you see. Right. And I think that, you're then turning against people, or sometimes seeing those memes, that are gonna aggravate you, that also might make your brain fire, and mm-hmm. make you feel at least something for a while. So I think that's kind of, I guess, my position right now in this moment of history.
Yeah, I think that's, that's great. You just gave me an idea of another source to put there, and I'll mention it now, but there's a book called Anti-Social. I think that's the title. And it's a New Yorker writer. And so he's a little too impressed with himself. They just are. I mean, they do some good work, but they're really impressed with themselves. But the value is that he did all these interviews with folks on the really, really, really far right. I saw a thing about QAnon crop up there. It's those kinds of folks. And you might go in and think, well, these guys don't want to... They're not looking to have a writer at the New Yorker, the liberal New Yorker. They're not going to, well, they were just sort of, they're like publicity hounds. They're, and the sense that you got, I think they even occasionally use the phrase, they would talk about, they just wanted to blow stuff up. There wasn't a sincere commitment to, there's something I truly believe in. They didn't believe in any of this stuff, but they were monetizing what they were doing. And there was that sort of market incentive to do that. And you, I mean, the last part of what you had to say was that there are a number of those emotional kinds of reactions that will generate an easier, bigger audience for you. And they're not good emotions. You know, they're not emotions that connect people to each other. They're emotions that drive people apart. And I'll add that to the list of stuff that I'm going to throw on that page. Again, if you can endure this guy's infatuation with himself, it's good interviews to look at. Can I jump around? There was, I'm just realizing that I'm going to like wrap things up at the end there, but Denise Lopez, Denise, are you there?
No, I don't see her on the list.
Oh, well, bummer.
No,
She had, oh, I don't know how to deal with this then. I was gonna, I told her she was gonna take the ball and run with it. I like the idea. She had emailed me a response to my question that I closed things with last time. And she had some really great ideas and I thought we would go on that, but I was gonna hand it off to her. So I don't even have my notes about what she had to say.
We'll have her posted on the Facebook group when we get it going.
There we go. Okay. Then let me do a couple of things.
Can I ask you one quick question before?
Yeah, fire away, Han.
So a lot of this has kind of been bouncing around in my head a little bit as I've mulled it over. And it strikes me that regardless of party, there has been, especially recently and in the past, however many years, a lot of fear that people have. And they seem to latch on to more of the extreme opinions, or they're not necessarily fact checking or something like that.
Right.
And it seems that it kind of goes hand in hand with this play on emotions.
Yeah.
That you see a lot. And I was kind of wondering, is that something as the advent of media has increased that we see more and more of? You know, just because there's been a larger access to information and people, you know, feel like they're trying to learn more. They don't feel like they know enough. And then they're exposed to all this and then they're scared and there's all these new ideas, you know, and it kind of that rabbit hole. Or is it something that's always been around, but it's just being capitalized on more?
Oh, well,
you know, it kind of is hard for me to just all of a sudden be like, oh, this is this huge new problem we have. It changes technology,
but it kind of, is.
Right.
And I mean, Fox News,
Mm-hmm.
come on, you take a look at the audience shares that Fox has just done a way better job of trading on those emotions, of trading on fear and anger. And it generates this much larger audience share than other cable TV stations. And that then becomes, it's a little bit like, God, I'm going to show my age. It used to be when folks actually watched series on TV and the program would be at the same time on the same day of the week, every week. If a program did well, got big audience share, everybody copied it. So you'd go through these waves of police dramas, or you could go through waves of legal dramas. they were all copying, to a certain degree, Fox News. Fox News led that movement on the part of cable TV stations to have more emotional kinds of broadcasts. And that was one of the points about those findings from last time, is like the networks weren't that far behind. So they've been losing audience share. So what do? They copy what's taking the audience share away from them, and they've done more. The brakes on this whole process are journalistic norms. And you still have folks at the major networks, at the major newspapers, adhering to a certain degree to those journalistic norms. But it's been kind of eroding the impact of those norms. Does that make sense in terms of putting those two things together? The market forces and then the journalistic norms that are kind of a brake on them, but they've not been an effective brake. And you've also multiplied the number of media outlets that are out there. And the folks who are journalists at those outlets, they're not journalists, they're personalities. Do this every once in a while, because I do it. When some idiot will post an article or an item or whatever, and they claim to be a journalist, look them up and take a look at what their background happens to be. And lots of times you'll see that they don't have a background in journalism. Maybe they just got out of college and they majored in journalism or communication studies, but they don't really have a history of working within the profession. And so you have herds of folks out there who call themselves journalists populating those outlets, and they're not journalists. They're not adhering, in the sense that they don't follow the journalistic norms. Does that kind of get there?
Yeah.
Okay. We're running down, so I'm going to use this. I'm going to do like the express version of this. Here's what I was going to talk about a little bit, and that had to do with the rest of the agenda setting model, and it had to do with issue legitimacy and group legitimacy, and then moving on to the issue typologies. And I'm going to guess that I'm just not going to get there. But let me do the stuff on. Let me do this more in terms of a presentation, just because I want to leave some time at the end to introduce a question, and then folks can kick it around to the extent they want. Here's where I was going to go, maybe in more length, but I'll do the express version. Remember, legitimacy, you can kind of equate it with respect. Think about it in terms of respectability. So is an issue respectable? Are people willing to treat it as a reasonable alternative? Group legitimacy is a group that you respect, okay? In the old system, you could get more issue legitimacy if your issue did not depart too much from the status quo, okay? Because you weren't asking for a big change. I'm not sure that the status quo does you any good anymore in terms of getting the issue on the systemic agenda, okay? I'm not sure it does you any good in terms of getting your issue on the institutional agenda either. When you amp up the role of emotions in the entire process, the notion that you're trying to be reasonable and have an issue that's not a big change from one that we've already kind of agreed to, I'm not sure that that matters as much anymore. And that the whole notion of legitimacy then feeds into the partisan polarization. And if an issue is regarded as legitimate for one side, it becomes not legitimate for the other. Again, making it difficult to build a broad-based support for getting an issue on systemic agenda. And I think that the current situation has obscured the extent to which in the old world you could get an issue on the agenda with relatively bipartisan public support.
Pat, quick
If
question.
you linked it, particularly if you linked it to the status quo. Somebody wanted to jump in.
Quick question. As someone that didn't take the public policy class.
Hey, Izzy.
Hey, how are you?
Good.
So as someone that didn't take the public policy class, were there
Yeah.
any specific dates you were thinking for the old system versus the new system? Like kind of what?
Well, things start moving in this direction with Ronald Reagan.
Okay, gotcha.
That's the signpost. Right. It's not full blown, right? These things take a while. And certainly, you didn't have Facebook in the 1980s.
Right.
Right. But you had some of these forces beginning to come into play.
Gotcha.
Okay, so that was the thing on issue legitimacy and group legitimacy. We had these nice concrete indicators of group legitimacy. How many members do you have? How many resources do you happen to have? And do you use sort of conventional tactics, right? And to the extent that you had large size, lots of resources, played nicely with others, you would be a more legitimate group, and you would, as the messenger for whatever issue you wanted to move onto the agenda, you would have certain advantages over groups that were smaller, didn't have as many resources, and maybe resorted to protest. Okay? So we used to do a little exercise on this. Remember, those of you, I'd bring in the Encyclopedia of Associations. We'd open it up to a random spot and you'd pick out a crazy interest group and we would evaluate its legitimacy. So the kinds of groups that have that sort of legitimacy, think AARP, think American Bankers Association, think the AMA, think the Chamber of Commerce, American Bar Association, the NRA, Common Cause. All groups with most of those criteria. I think that partisan polarization may have blown that up as well. So that if even a group that in the past you would have regarded as legitimate happens to be on the other side of the partisan divide from you, you're not going to be brought on to that scope of involvement because they think it's an issue. So it's balkanized the impact of group legitimacy as well as issue legitimacy. And if you think about this,
I'm sorry, can I ask a question, Pat?
Sure.
I have a question about governmental institutions that are supposed to be nonpartisan or historically were nonpartisan, where they fit into the group legitimacy discussion here. I'm thinking of, GAO, FBI, previously DOJ. Are they now in the same camp as some of the groups that you were just mentioning that were outside of government?
Yeah,
it does feel like there's a shift in the group legitimacy even within government.
Right, that was kind of where I was going. What I want to remind you about is that groups are non-governmental groups.
Yeah, governmental groups, I'm sorry, but having worked in the federal government sector, I'm not sure the right term is nonpartisan. So when you're in the federal government, you're with DOJ, you're with FBI. GAO is a different matter. They're between Congress. We work for the administration.
Yeah. I can.
We're an agent of the administration.
Right.
We are not independent agencies that can act on their own.
Yeah. I can kind of get to this and then get these things properly sorted at this point. So when you're talking about those entities, regardless of whether they are sort of part of the administration or a sort of outside independent kind of organization. That's when you're talking about the institutional agenda. Okay, so so then if you think about the impact of those changes in, I want to focus on group legitimacy. That gets fed into that set of partisan boxes that are out there as well. And so if you're in the wrong, if your group has allied with the other party, well, you're going to really have a hard time getting anything on the institutional agenda, even if it's a minor change in existing policy. Okay. In terms of those more independent kinds of agencies within the government, they don't really play a role in terms of agenda setting. They'll play a role in terms of policy making and implementation. We're just not there yet. Okay, does that make sense? What the heck? Let's have a little fun here. I'm going to come up short, but I can do this next time. I think the really interesting thing has to do with tactics. I think that the whole Black Lives Matter protests that are going on, you know, in the wake of George Floyd and numerous other killings, I'm going to tell you that I am astounded at how that has kind of taken over the system. Now, mind you, you're getting some, well, the story, oh, come on, I can't remember now which one of you mentioned this. It was about all the focus that Fox will place on all the rioting and looting, but apart from that, really, it's just out there. There's in the past, if you had that kind of protest, most of the time, you'd suffer backlash. Now, yeah, you got backlash from Fox. You got backlash from, honestly, a relatively small number of entities. But I want us to think about and understand what in the world happened this time that it, like we've had plenty of murders of Black folks by police, plenty of them. What in the world happened this time? Because this looks like a change in the legitimacy of using protest as a tactic. Does that make sense to y'all? Because that like, has that not puzzled you that this just took off like crazy?
Well, the murder happened on TV. I mean, I think that's what's different is that a man was murdered in front of everyone, and it was on
but there was
television.
There was video of other murders. It's not the first
No,
time.
this one, I think this one was different in that, you know, I think the nature of the murder was different in that you saw a man pleading for his life, and you saw white police officers not doing anything. Hey, you might be right. And you also might be right that I think that there's always been in our country protest and violent protest that has led to change into policy setting. I don't know if this is much different than maybe in the 60s, maybe some of the labor movement. I'm not sure that it's much different.
But what's changed? What legislation have we had?
Well, even I don't want to. Yeah, and I don't want to get. You're right. I don't want to get that far just yet. But I'm impressed with the like everybody getting on board. No, we've got to do something about police reform. And the protest really is, that's the dynamic that's moving that forward. And
Question.
yeah.
When you say the legitimacy of the protest, do you mean that public opinion has shifted to be more favorable?
It's that
Or
historically,
I guess media too.
historically, protest was regarded as as kind of un-American. Okay. I mean, there was the story that I would tell in class of, you know, my one anti-war march where, you know, I saw what backlash looked like, where they roped off half of the street. The organizers were waving some kids to come across the street, and a guy driving tried to run him down. And that's what protest historically would face. I think that's much less likely with what's going on right now, that it's because it's spread so widely. This was just like on college campuses, you know, it wasn't spreading in the same kind of way. The protest eventually had some outcomes, some consequences, but it looked and felt to me like it was struggling a whole lot more. And this, you know, we're not getting to Anne's point just yet, right? About, well, there's still no policy yet. But in terms of moving stuff on the agenda, this is moving like a rocket without the same kind of backlash that protest historically would engender. Does that make sense a little bit?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
So Pat, I don't know how, I don't want to say how it happens. I don't know how, but I will say that something that feels different to me is that it's been quite young, like very young people who have actually in our state organized all of our protests. I mean, I'm talking like 15, 14, 15-year-olds, like really young, not even college age, like high school age. And I think there's something where like people don't really feel comfortable bashing like a 14-year-old kid necessarily, like, oh, you know, like there's something in a weird way, having young people like that stand up feels a little bit more oddly legitimate, because like you don't want to say like, oh, well, these kids are, you know, because they are bringing along adults too. I don't want to make it sound, but I'll say almost every single one organized in my area has been by like teenagers.
Yeah.
So that feels kind of different to me.
Yeah. I think I see some of the same generational sort of divide there, that, and you see it on a number of issues, right? Climate change is a really big one. It's a generational divide there, where it's largely younger folks who are pushing hard on climate change, and it's old farts like me, not like me, but my age, who are, you know, don't want to put that on the agenda. And a real sense, the midterms kind of got this rolling as well. You got a lot of young, much younger people running for office and running successfully in the 2018 midterms. That's the generational thing. That's an interesting thing to put into this. I think you've got something.
Well, and it's also a little awkward when, again, locally, because this is what happened here, we have, to be perfectly blunt, middle-aged white men bringing guns to a protest with a bunch of 14-year-old kids. Like, that feels so inappropriate. And I think that the public saw that, and they're like, I live in Maine, so we're, you know, pretty rural, but like, it really was like these, you know, people came with their guns trying to say like, you are terrible protesters, and then it's like a bunch of high school kids, and that like looks really bad.
Yeah, when you said that, actually, what you know, particularly in the wake of John Lewis's death, it has notes of those civil rights protests where you had the, you know, this is Jennifer's thing about having video, seeing that right in front of you, the dogs getting unleashed on protesters, protesters getting hosed down, protesters getting beaten with clubs. You know, this isn't happening to them, but that the old guys with guns kind of sounds like that horrible force that it then looks just really bad, and that then legitimizes the protesters, because folks are going to feel more sorry for them or more sympathetic toward them.
Pat, I also wonder if there's some, in addition to the generational things that were pointed out, the point about the images that you can see in real time, it seemed like there was a convergence of a number of those incidents. So we had George Floyd,
right?
We had Ahmaud Arbery here in Georgia on video. We had then the subsequent police atrocities that were videoed after police were aware that everybody was paying attention, such as the Kenosha thing, where
Right.
I think that it seemed like a confluence of events that white people in particular were like, what is going on? I thought we were doing better than we were. And so now it was more everybody kind of understanding from a firsthand account that things are maybe not where we thought they were. I mean, it just seemed like there was a convergence. Oh, and the Amy Cooper thing in the Central Park, where she called the police and you heard her feign distress and white privilege. All those things happened really close together that I felt like collectively really rallied a lot of people that maybe may not have normally been the ones to hit the streets to protest. But that it was a confluence of visuals that people couldn't deny anymore.
Yeah, and it may also be that that this sort of cascades. That we may have sadly had these things occurring just as frequently, but somehow these all got packed out into the public airspace at the same time, and that folks from around the country then brought those in, you know, and because of the nature of the media, you can bring all those things in, and then it feels like a crush of those. So that goes back to this then played the role of a crisis. Sadly, it took like a whole bunch of crises to make an effective crisis to get it on the agenda.
Yeah, I guess, Pat, I'd like to explore how all this, you know, matters, if at all, with the new media environment in terms of agenda setting, because it's a different environment, and I'm still processing a little bit about, do the protests now, are they more impactful than they might have been in previous generations? I'm not sure, but my question is, what, if anything, does it matter given the media environment that we're in and the political polarization? So I'm just trying to think about what does it matter, if at all? And I have a little bit of my cynical hat on, but
but no, really think about
not surprising. But you know, does it? Because anyway. I'll leave it there.
But I'll say, think about how much we've changed in a very short time culturally. Think about Colin Kaepernick, right? Oh my God, he couldn't kneel, right? And now look at all of these sports players and all the stuff they're doing.
Right.
I mean, I realize that that's kind of like small on the surface, but at the same time, like that just speaks to the fact that now it's like acceptable, and like years ago it wasn't acceptable.
And I think because we're talking about agenda setting, that's precisely what we're talking about. The fact that you get, I mean, it's a substantial portion of the public who thinks this ought to be addressed. Not that you've accomplished anything yet, but you then have really prominent folks like professional athletes. You know they're prominent because we pay them lots, right?
But it kind of presumes you have a Congress that functions and knows
Yeah,
how
again, that's farther
to
down the line.
legislate.
Yeah.
And I'm not convinced that's the case,
Yeah.
which traditionally you'd have these forces and then we get translated into, I'm not seeing it.
Yeah. Maybe this is, and because we're probably running late.
I wasn't sure if you wanted me to
I
tell
think
you.
we're running late. Let me try and now sort of wrap my head around stuff. Yeah, what the heck? Here's how I'm gonna do this. If you think about all the things we're talking about here, I want to pose a possibility for you, and I want you to think about it. And this will feed into Anne's pessimistic side here. If you remember how I started out, the way that, and the reason that folks were interested in agenda setting had to do with democratic rule. So the notion was you would have issues percolate up from the public. You'd move from the systemic informal agenda up to the formal institutional agenda. However, with all of those kinds of changes, I'm being vague, but for the sake of brevity, is that a misguided way of thinking about the process? I oversimplified things in the class for the sake of emphasizing the potential for democracy there. In fact, you've always had some movement in the other direction, from the institutional formal agenda onto the systemic informal agenda. Elites would start talking about an issue as important, and they would then try to generate public support for pursuing that issue. The question I want to leave you with, and for us to start out next time, and I am going to just, there's stuff that I was going to do on agenda setting, forget it. I'll just leave it aside, because I think people really want to get into the policymaking thing, okay? But does this mean that we've tipped the balance over and we're primarily now moving things from the institutional agenda to the systemic agenda, from elites to masses? And let me throw the major thing in there. More than one person the last time talked about what was going on in the media as emotional manipulation. Are you talking about the agenda setting process now being characterized to a large degree, not entirely, okay, but to a larger degree than past, with elites emotionally manipulating ordinary citizens to get on board with their ideas for what ought to be addressed by the government? Okay? And again, I want to emphasize, I'm not saying this is a black and white thing. It wasn't black and white in the other direction. It's not black and white in this direction. Just talking about what's going on with policing reform says it's not all moving from elites to masses. That's genuinely moving from informal systemic agenda up to the institutional agenda. But in terms of a balance, do you see things moving in that direction or not?
Perfect. So we will include that on the questionnaire to follow. And then also, what would be helpful, and Pat and I have talked about, if you have specific work experience, particularly in agenda setting, if you have anything in that area that you can contribute to the conversation outside of your general observations, particularly work experience and professional experience of those that are directly involved in the agenda setting, those would be helpful.
And actually show up for the next class so I'm not left hanging. Don't be like Denise, like actually show up, so that, because it's much better. I mean, that's why I did it, was I was going to just step back and I would rather let you folks step up and then talk about those kinds of experiences and in a sense lead that discussion rather than me. I don't have the direct experience that you guys have. I think it's more productive and it'll be more fun if you do it. So yeah.
Wonderful. All right. We'll follow up with an email soon. Thank you so much, ladies. Appreciate it. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you.
Thanks, Dr.
Bye.
Pierre.
Thank
Take
you.
care.